Welcome. My name is Debbie Kraft, and I serve as Vice President of the Cushing Library Board. We have lots of great programming that I will tell you about in between our speakers so that you're aware of what the Cushing Library does. This afternoon, the Cushing Library and the Camden Conference are pleased to host this Zoom presentation by Cushing residents Brooke Harrington and Judith Bing. This is the second of our two events for this year's conference. Ellen Goldsmith's poetry session took place last fall, and it was excellent. Next year, if you didn't see Ellen's presentation this year, you definitely don't want to miss it next year. The library is grateful to the Camden Conference for its contribution to our library. Judy and Brooke's presentation, titled Architecture as Expression of Change, Considering Food in Ukraine, will provide an architectural perspective on this year's Camden Conference theme, which is Global Trade and Politics, Managing Turbulence. And this conference will take place live stream February 17th through the 19th. And for more information on that, you need to go to the Camden Conference website. Brooke and Judy will describe change in architecture in two ways. First, in the evolving architecture of granaries and their importance in societies. And second, through a historic survey of architecture in Ukraine. Both presenters are retired architects and architecture professors who moved to Maine from Philadelphia over a decade ago. They continue to pursue their research interests. Brooke will begin and Judy will follow, and they will respond to your questions and comments afterwards. So please, when you think of a question, if they're speaking, write it in the chat room, and it should be on the lower bar of your screen. And then I will direct those questions to the presenters when both presentations are finished. Okay, Brooke, I'm going to turn it over to you so you can share your screen. Okay, share screen button. There we go.
First of all, I want to thank both the library and also the Camden Conference for supporting the library so that we can make this presentation. Okay, I'm trying to advance it. Let's see. Here. So as Debbie said, I'm going to be talking about granaries and their importance in societies. And historically, I'm looking at the earliest records that we have of the importance of granaries, then some cultural importances, and 19th and 20th century heritage of granaries, and finally the things that we see today and the power that granaries have and grain elevators have in showing the trade implications. When we think about enduring civilizations, basically they depend a lot about social protection and food security. The ancient civilizations actually lasted for quite a long time, and anywhere from 7,000 years to 5,000 years before what we call the current era, which starts with the Christian calendar. They're defined as having shared communication strategies, language, alphabet, as numeric systems, systems for administering territories, infrastructure, engineering, laws, sanitation, hygiene. They also contain a complex division of labor, which we don't think about too much in our daily lives, but it's quite a sophisticated set of rules that we have. And also division into social and economic classes. They typically have large population centers with support areas where food, raw materials, and storage facilities occur, as well as having a strong presence with architectural artifacts and art. So it wasn't until around 1911 that the historical calendar started thinking of actually the Fertile Crescent as the important place where societies developed and civilizations developed. An Egyptologist, James Henry Breasted, who taught at the University of Chicago, coined the term Fertile Crescent. And this map shows the earliest records of what they have recorded of presence of cereals, grains, as well as domestication of livestock. A little note down the bottom of this shows first the consumption of, in blue, of wild grains, and then the evidence of domestication of cereals. So the first places we'll look at are in Assyria, Babylonia, Sumer, and Elam, which was part of Persia. So Uruk in Sumer was the city that was founded back in 4500 BC, before the current era. And it was large. It had 50 to 80,000 people. Susa and Elam, 4200 BCE. Babylonia, 1700 to 1600, and Nineveh, about 700 BCE. So how do we know that these places were rich in granaries and also had a complicated system for storing these? So there are seals that were used to actually attach to bags of grains, as well as to the granaries themselves, to indicate what came in, what left, who was the donor or provider of this. And in these civilizations, there was obviously a tribute or tax that was given. So archaeologists have done great studies, and what we see on the left are some of the illustrations of these things. E is actually the remnant of one of the seals, which dates back to 3100 BCE, is in Britain at a museum. Below in Ur, Queen Puabi made one of these seals. Here it shows the device, which one can think of as a printing vehicle. They take, you could take any soft medium like clay and roll this across it, and you create images. So they have thousands of these that have been saved and recorded. This shows Queen Puabi drinking from a straw. She had a gold straw, apparently. Beer that was made from the grains, and below you see her with a chalice, a goblet, drinking wine. So here's another set of illustrations by Tate Sewell Paulette, and also from Denise Schman Bezeret, that shows the illustrations that were recorded on these seals that show the characteristics of these granaries, the earliest granaries. And in the bottom left hand, you will see a clay tablet that has impressions, both cuneiform and other pictorial, that were this piece of clay was used as a rationing card for anybody who worked in the granaries, storing them, and it was sort of a way for them to get their food. So we'll move right to the Indus Valley, which is very adjacent to the Arabian Sea, and is now Pakistan is this area. The ancient Hibgar, Haraba, and Mohoji Daro, which is the Mohojo Haro is there, and Harappa is there, and up here is Megar. And the first photograph in the top here shows at one level during the period that they referred to as 2A, granaries, which were very tight chambers to hold the grain that was saved. In the bottom, we see an illustration of the city of Mohenjo-Daro with the citadel and granaries that are next to it. In here, we have a comparison of the two sites, Harappa, and here's where the granaries, the great granaries are. And this was a computer drawing that illustrates what they surmise went on in these spaces. And you can see here actually the physical site of that location of the great granaries in Harappa. And Mohenjo-Daro, you see one of the drawings made by archaeologists, and beside it you can see a photograph from what's it called? An aerial photograph that's taken from Google Earth that shows the condition of the site right now. And there's in red shows where the granaries were. So moving on to Egypt, ancient Egypt with the pharaohs also had a bustling civilization, and everything was based around the Nile. And I'm going to look at three sites, Edfu and Jebelim, and the third is Karanis. And what you see in this slide is actually the excavation, and they're digging up granaries, silos that actually predate the introduction of the Temple of Horus, which was introduced around 273 BCE. But the excavations actually go back as 2400 BCE. And this is a set of photographs that show some of these silos and the very careful work that goes on season after season. It's done for about 8 years, and it continues with different archaeologists and recorders of these devices, these silos. They basically have found bits of grain within these chambers, as well as a lot of them were done with mud brick and covered with a stucco-like material. Also in Egypt, an older one, actually it's about the same, you'll see there were tombs of Iti and Neferu from the 11th dynasty, 2050 BCE, and it shows the granaries, these black objects with doors that allow the removal of grain. Typically, the grain was put in the top and then it could be taken out of the side. These are two little models that were put within the tomb of Iti and Neferi. You can see that they used animals to bring them, and then the baskets were taken so that the materials could be the grains could be put in a safe place inside the granaries. And the third one that we'll look at, Karanis, is interesting. It's up near the estuary, the delta of the Nile, and it's much later. This is a lot of this work was done by archaeologists from University of Michigan, spanning from the 1920s on. And we'll be looking at this level C, which but here's an indication of bedrock to 15 meters above bedrock. And you can see by this, there's a recording of all the different buildings that have been stacked upon one another and then found and exposed by the archaeologists. And here's actually photographs taken, I believe, in the 20s that show one of the large granaries. And this is during the time when the Ptolemies, the Greeks, and the Romans controlled Egypt, and the pharaohs were actually also Greek and Roman rulers, right? These are taken shots, and this one is a study done by Samantha Lash from Brown University, who is looking at the remnants that were found within this one complex, and it shows the type of material, papyrus and mud and wood and glass and ceramics. So it's every one of these shows an indication of what was there. The pieces were actually, the granaries were used to be a central distribution to be shipped from Egypt back to either Greece or Rome, depending on the era. So moving on, we're actually looking at ancient Egypt. The Egyptian period was long, and of course, Beijing, what we call Beijing, took many different forms. The map on the bottom right shows the many different stages of what we now call Beijing. The map on the left shows the Forbidden City, which wasn't built until the current year, 1406, but it also shows the importance of waterways, which were used to bring food to the city. Now, Beijing was a big population center, but most of the free food, the grain, both wheat and rice, were brought from the southern part of China. And basically, these are three areas that they were brought from. It shows that there were ever normal granaries that were the Chengping Xiang granaries, and then the Tiao granaries that were open for people to use. This shows, and you can see the solid black dots show the outer granaries that were for public sale. And then you see some within the inner city. And these are actually the gates, the different gates. And all this is recorded and kept track of. The waterways of the Grand Canal, which was started during the Sui dynasty, was continued and never finished until in the Qing dynasty, which was started in 1644. This is an illustration done in the 12th century from Zhang Zuduan, and it shows one portion of a long scroll. And the illustration below is a photograph taken in 2008, and the Grand Canal extends over 1,700 kilometers in China, and it was used to bring conscripts as well as food up to the capital. Within Beijing, they always wanted to make sure there was no rebellions, so they always shipped enough food so that there was food present for the large population. But in the Jia dynasty, in this southern part of China, there was actually some in-ground granaries that were made where they were lined with pottery, and then the grain was put within. And this shows some excavations that have been done. But these are as old as 4,000 years ago that these were put on. Below in the Qing dynasty, which actually went into the 20th century, you can see the traditional large granaries that were put in place and are now reused as many different things, in some cases art studios. Now I'm going to move to back to the Mediterranean, and this is a tomb that was built in around 850 BCE, and on it are 5 granaries. Granaries have always been a sign of wealth and success. And the highest level was the presence of 5 granaries. And so this is actually the tomb of a very wealthy woman who died at around 50 years old. And this is the casket chamber for the person and her child that were put in this. This is on display in Athens. And this shows these model granaries, which were filled with pieces of gold and ivory that were put on. But actually, it was Solon, a magistrate who started this, let's say around 600 BCE. And the highest level, where there were 5 of these granaries, real granaries, it was called the Pentakiaso Medimnoi, and that held, each Medimnoi was represented a quantity of 100. So it could produce in a year the equivalent of 370 bushels of grain. What we see below with the 3 horses is a representation of the second class of citizenry. In Athens, the hippos, and they were a class of knights, and they could maintain a horse in the land and produce 300 medinois, measures of grain. And then below is Zugetai, which was the basically a household that had a pair of oxen, and they plowed and they could produce 200 medinoi, measures of grain a year, which is equivalent to about 290 bushels of grain. And then the Thetes, who were basically the common laborers who didn't have a land allotments for growth of grain, but could work for others and could never be turned into slaves. Okay, the next group, next place I'm going to go is into Japan. And in 690 CE, it was adopted by the Shintos as a building type, and it was used both in houses and the creation of granaries. And this shows one, you can see, let's see, it doesn't say here, but I think this is a 1973 photograph. The Shinto religion believes in a way of life where their change is a basic part of their culture. And there's a yearly cycle, life cycle that goes on. So actually, if you ever get the chance, you should go to these. It says the Shintos believe that kamis, or gods, occupy everything, occupy people, occupy buildings and land. And basically this building has been turned into a temple. And here you see 2 treasury houses and a main structure for worship. And it's contained within a series of walls so that very few people can actually see them. There have actually been the 62nd rebuilding of the Ise Jingu was done in 2013. It's now done every 20 years and has been. So this shows the sort of the elevation of the simple building type to a shrine, a religious building. Again, this is shown within the inner walls, treasury buildings, these small granaries, and then the main shrine. It's beautifully made, and Miscanthus reeds are used for the roofs, and what they call katsujoji are these big, heavy wooden pieces which actually hold down the ridge line because of the way the structure is made. There's a chance that it would actually lift. So here are extractions from a YouTube you may want to see. It shows the cutting of the cypress from local areas. It shows the pulling in a ritual of these to the site. It shows the consecration of the new site. There's a blank site waiting for the rebuilding, so that by doing it every 20 years, they basically have novice carpenters and experienced carpenters and masters who work on this, and they carefully plane each one of these and put a protective scaffolding and enclosure around it. And then finally, it's all done with pegs to hold the thing together. You can see the placing of those and the pegs underneath. And then they also collect stones from the Isuzu River adjacently and select special stones to be put around the base of these, and then there is a ritual for that. So here is the previous shrine, which is then, completely disassembled and moved to other areas in pieces and reused in things. And this is the new one that's just been completed. And here's a show from 1973 showing that. So now this is a change of space. This shows the simple granaries that were built in the Balkans. Studies that Judy and I did back in the 80s, continuing on through 2000. And this shows locations. This is in a monastery, and the granary is here, and there are workspaces and storage spaces for other things. And there's also a beautiful chamber for doing other work. In this one on a private farm in Serbia, there is a granary and place to store wine casks on the bottom, and a guest house, so that people who come to the farm to buy produce or grain or wine have a place to stay. Here's another example in another area. This is in Croatia and has kosh or kotobana, where they store their corn cribs behind that are used. And this is actually in Turkey, which shows a granary and also a workspace adjacent that could be used. Let's see, this doesn't like me to hit that. Okay. This is in the Vojvodina area of Serbia, and it has this is reclaimed land when the Austro-Hungarians occupied the area, and they drained all of the swamps between the Sava and the Danube River, and they created villages. And basically, the granary gets an honorific place, granaries and corn cribs, and they face the street, basically, so people can see the amount of wealth and ability to create and maintain trade. The tops are of wood, the bottoms are made of mud brick and stucco, and often the bottoms are used for storing tools or for livestock or fowl. They have one of the oldest granaries that was present in a place called Kupanovo, actually has a masonry base with vents and then a wooden above to keep the grain safe and dry. And this shows a view where I was walking on the porch, and you can see the road and dwelling beyond. And I think one more advance. And this is in a place, another place, and in this case, the extended family members live below. This is a drive-through to get to the fields beyond, and there are granaries and corn cribs within that. In the mountains, in the small mountains, there are older villages that have been turned into ethnic parks, and this shows a corn crib, which they call a kosh, and the ambar, which is their name for a granary, and it's made out of wooden planks. They're typically, they put a ladder up here and dump the material in there. This is in Slovenia, and because it's in the Julian Alps, there's a lot of rain, so it's difficult for them to dry the hay, so then they can thresh it and put the grain into storage compartments, storage buildings. So these are kozelets, for indeed drying the straw, and they use the ground level for storing the equipment that they use. Here you can see the intricate joinery that's used on the corners of these, because actually they're structural forces that require these buildings to be very strong. And here you can see a more intricate joint that's made on this two-cell granary. In this part of the Balkans, they're called kasha. And I've just before we leave, I'll show another monastery that has a granary hidden actually within the gallery space. And here it is, and this is Judy sitting in it. You can see the drawings we made of sections of this monastery from drawings we received. If you here, these mountains are actually in Albania. So here we are today. We've moved from the small villages and individual owners to collectives, and now grain is stored in elevators, and people bring their materials to where they can be sold. So obviously in the US, they bring them to locations where they can either be trucked or taken up by train. This is a wonderful book.
It's okay.
Done in 1993, and it shows the morphology and typology of different granaries. These two examples show the crib method of wooden granaries, and this shows the studded method. In the studded method, there's typically reinforcing at each level to ensure that everything works well. And as I said, they're studying the forms, the types of buildings, as well as the spaces they have. And they did a very good job showing photographs, proportions, plans of these, elevations, sections in two directions, and a axonometric drawing of this. This shows the studded with bands. This shows a brick granary, and it seems a little weird, but this is a way of making sure that there's an integrity, because arches give thrusts outward. So basically, in order to make this work, they put a banding around this so that the brick could survive. They experimented with steel. The trouble with steel was they didn't take into account temperature differences. They tried tile, and tile was leaked through the joints. And they finally went to concrete, which is a preferred method now. And they have basically, it means there it could be increased by 30 or 40 feet in height. And you can see this series that of different profiles and types that have been built. And these are statements of where these are located or were located. And then again, variations of these. And now we'll move to the big guys. And here, this is actually some tiles that were made. And you can see how they're ganged together. And also, they're built typically near rivers or places where large ships can come in to take this. So the ground is very soft that they typically have to build them on piles to take the weight. And here's a worm's eye view underneath of a brick, a series, of steel, but they're held within a encasement of masonry so that they can be protected from thermal changes. Here is some illustrations of New York Port Authority terminal in Brooklyn. And on the right is the channel side in Buffalo, showing the river, a separate minor river next to the Lake Erie that has a large group of these grain elevators. Here's Bund in Quebec City, the embankment, and the great granaries they have. They ship grain to from the open plains of Canada over to the St. Lawrence, where they can be sold and traded to other countries. But you can see there, the granaries become a large urban object, and they've been turned into an asset. This light show is called called Borealis, and they have seasonal shows with lighting on these different gangs of grain elevators. And here we have a bevy of different presentations that are done on the Buffalo, some of the grain elevators in Buffalo. That was it was a competition that was won by a company in Montreal. And here's an evening view of the grain elevators in Ukraine in one location, and this is the Cargill grain elevator terminals, which are in Odessa in a different location. Okay, I want to end with, since we're talking about grain and the capacity of us to actually provide food globally and global trade, it's anticipated by 2025 there's going to be a great water shortage, and that's going to stress the amount of grain crops that can be produced globally. And so this is an indication of the predictions, and you can see typically with also the increase in temperature with the change in climate. And you can see that there are parts where it's going to be very difficult. And actually, Ukraine is in that area where there'll be higher problems with water stress. And we look at this, and it's these are produced by the Department of the Interior. And even though 71% of the surface is covered with water, if you take all the water from the globe and you make a globe out of that, it's only this large. So, and when you take, so it shows it's a very small part of the earth in the atmosphere. But the usable water, could be potable and used for growing things and for needing direct sustainability of people, is less than 1% of the water that we have on the globe is usable. So it's always something that's hard to remember, given the fact that the surface looks like it's everywhere. And these are projections to 2050 about the percentage of change in yields between the present and 2050. One of the areas of increase you'll see is in Canada, in the Americas, and actually in Russia, and in the Himalayas, and in Scandinavia. And this is because of the warming. New areas will become warm enough where growth can occur, but where the heat is overtaking, there's a decrease, which is the problem that faces all of us. Thank you. I think that I'm going to stop for a minute, and I'm going to stop the share so that we can change to Judy's presentation.
Okay, thank you, Brooke. If you have any questions, I see there are two in there. If you have any questions for Brooke, please go to chat and put them down. And then when Judy's finished, we will answer questions. Okay, and in the meantime, while Judy's getting ready, I just want to let you know of some of the events that'll be coming to the Cushing Library. We actually have a really busy year planned. We're already booked through the end of August. So we're doing pretty good with that. In February, we have educator Nancy Perkins doing a Zoom presentation on murder mysteries by writers of the UK. We've had her before. She's excellent. She's going to talk about a whole new class of mystery writers. In March, we have author and poet Elizabeth Garber, and she's going to be discussing her newest book, Sailing at the Edge of Disaster. That'll be live and in person, and it's free. All our events are free. April, we have authors and poets Laura Bonazzoli and Jody Poloni. They will be here talking about their books, and that's a live event. Also in April, we have it's either going to be the end of March, not sure on the dates here, or maybe the first week in April. So we're having an Easter egg hunt for the children, and we do this every year. It's a lot of fun. And if you have any grandchildren or young children of your own, you're welcome to bring them. These events can be found on the Cushing Public Library website, so please visit us there. Okay, and I think Judy is ready.
Judy is ready.
Okay, I'm going to mute.
Excellent. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're moving from grain to Ukraine, as you can see. When Russia invaded a year ago, I began reading about Ukraine, soon realizing that as an architect, I needed to visualize its physical environment, its built heritage, to begin understanding a place and culture I barely knew. So here's an outline of this survey of Ukraine's architectural heritage with a particular focus on Kyiv. Otherwise, I'm afraid we'd be here all night. So I have framed this pretty tightly. I am no expert on Ukraine's history, but have distilled what I've learned into key historic intervals with architectural contributions. And I will show a lot of maps, like this one from 2014, always circling when I can, Kyiv. These maps locate Ukraine in Europe and show its regions and topography. The right and left banks of the bisecting Dnipro River, the zones of forest and steppe, and that valuable black soil. These lands have been inhabited since prehistoric times, beginning over 20,000 years ago by late Paleolithic mammoth hunters and later Neolithic agriculturalists, whom we know of through archaeology. Ancient Greek traders colonized the Black Sea coast during the 7th to 3rd centuries BCE, the first settlers to provide us with written records. To their north, Scythian nomads arrived by horseback from the eastern steppe and left burial mounds filled with extraordinary gold objects. We have to go to museums to look at these. Numerous peoples migrated across the Proto-Ukrainian lands, the Slavs achieving a lasting imprint with their language and pagan religion. They built fortified settlements like that in this model. The Dnipro River became an important north-south trade route connecting Scandinavia with Byzantium. Varangian traders, known to us as Vikings, navigated as far south as Constantinople and traded with riverside settlements along their way. Rus, by the way, was the ethnic name for these traders from the north. The earlier mythical founding of Kyiv is credited to 3 legendary brothers and their sister, Ki giving his name. And it's celebrated in the city park with the sculpture beside the river. A Slavic settlement was present by the 6th century, the core of a state that would eventually expand west to the Carpathian Mountains and far to the northeast. Kievan Rus was ruled by the Rurikid dynasty, which began in the northern town of Novgorod in 862 by a Varangian or Rus chieftain named Rurik. Rurik's successor, Oleg of Novgorod, conquered Kyiv in 879 and relocated the capital from Novgorod, so founding Kievan Rus. And of course, Novgorod would later become part of Russia. So you can grasp this dual claim to roots in medieval Rus. Christianity officially arrived in Kievan Rus with the conversion of Volodymyr the Great in 998, his baptism imagined here in the 19th century painting, marking the northward expansion of Byzantine Christian orthodoxy. Kiev attained prominence as the center of Kievan Rus and East Slavic civilization during the 10th through 12th centuries. Kiev's early Church of the Tithes, completed in 996 but later destroyed, was constructed by order of Volodymyr the Great and is known from reconstruction views as a multi-domed and vaulted Byzantine building made of banded brick. So I did my B's. Yaroslav the Wise, son of Volodymyr, is remembered as a patron of Slavonic literary culture and also a sponsor of St. Sophia Cathedral, completed in 1037. This cathedral still stands. Its Byzantine forms now encased in 16th century additions. It was named after the 6th century church of Hagia Sophia, or Holy Wisdom, in Constantinople, but in design is different, notably in its 13 cupolas stepping up to the tall central dome, more cupolas than typical in Byzantine design. The plan of St. Sophia incorporates 5 naves and 5 apses, still present, dark brown in that plan, with later masses shown in tan to support those future taller towers. The multiple small units of space characterize the design, and within, original 11th century frescoes and mosaics do remain. Kiev was a fortified city in the 11th century, its primary access through the Golden Gate, a crenellated masonry mass topped with domed church and set into wooden ramparts, an imitation of the Golden Gate of Constantinople. Only the holiest cities of Eastern Orthodoxy had golden gates. All of these images are conjectural, including this full-scale reconstruction in central Kiev. Kievan Rus reached its peak in the 11th century, comprising several principalities, lands, and dependencies. During the tumultuous 12th century, the unsettled southeastern wild fields were considered a borderland, or Ukraina, a term eventually applied to an area on both sides of the Dnipro River. After Grand Prince Yaroslav's death in 1054, his sons divided Rus, warring factions resulted, and Kiev's central role declined. Kievan lands well beyond, as the map on the right shows, were overtaken and destroyed by the Mongol army of Batu Khan and subsumed by the Khanate of the Golden Horde. So out of Kiev's approximately 50,000 then inhabitants, only about 2,000 survived the Mongol siege of 1240, and most of the city was burned. The remnants of the Kievan state shifted to principalities in the west, forming the kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, which lasted from the mid-13th to mid-14th centuries, with the city of Lviv as its capital. Pardon my terrible pronunciation, please. Rus finally collapses, caught between pressure from the Mongols in the east and forces emerging in Western Europe. So the remains of Rus were taken over by a quickly expanding state, Lithuania. The Mongols had a more durable impact in the north, by the way, creating a Mongol vassal state called Muscovy, its new capital, a former minor village called Moscow. So on the right-hand map, a dynastic marriage formed the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1569, with Poland annexing most of future Ukrainian lands. During the 16th and 17th century, Polish political and cultural structures predominated, Polish nobility overtaking Ukrainian boyars and introducing Roman Catholicism and new social strata. Rural Orthodox peasants became the serfs of Catholic Polish landowners. Unrest ensued, and rebellious peasants fled to those wild fields of the southeastern steppe. So we need to look to the east to fill in another chapter in Ukraine's early history. Ukraine divided, the Cossack Hetmanate. So who were the Cossacks? They were both Slavic and Orthodox. They were free people, often escapees from serfdom, and who, by the 15th century, were living independently in dispersed communities. The Cossacks of Zaporizhia, the wild fields of the frontier beyond the rapids of the lower Dnipro River, were the Cossack group most connected with future Ukraine. Skilled fighters, the Cossacks obtained privileges, independence, self-governance in exchange for their military service. These images depict typical Cossacks over time in a sort of corny way, but yeah, from military to settled, and a portrait of Bohdan Khmelnytsky, their most significant leader. The map shows the Cossack state at its largest extent in 1649, including the lands of Kiev, a time of the growing usage of Ukraine as its informal name. Zaporizhian Cossack communities were called hosts, and between the 16th and 18th centuries, their fortified capital was the Zaporizhian Sich, reconstructed in Ukrainian Zaporizhia, as you see. The Zaporizhian governing assembly, illustrated upper right, was called the Rada, and its leader, the Hetman, hence the Cossack Hetmanate. Cossack Hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky led a ferocious rebellion against Polish-Lithuanian oppression in the late 1640s. In January 1649, he entered Kiev to triumphal acclaim as depicted in this dramatic 19th century painting. Following his arrival in Kiev, Khmelnytsky created an independent Cossack state, the Hetmanate. He established a system of government, creating a local administration under new governing elite drawn from the Cossack officers and initiating relations with foreign states. Their gift to future Ukraine, an egalitarian culture without czars or nobility. Khmelnytsky reportedly made a treaty with the Russian Tsardom to protect the Eastern Cossack state in exchange for some degree of allegiance, an act that secured autonomy for the Hetmanate, albeit under sovereignty of the Tsar. Baroque Kiev. Under the Hetmanate, Orthodoxy flourished in Ukraine and became the driving force behind an extraordinary cultural revival in Kiev and its surroundings in the 17th and 18th centuries. Two individuals were key to this revival. In 1632, Petro Mohyla, pictured left, the Orthodox Metropolitan of Kiev, Galicia, and Olive Rus, established educational institutions, advances in literacy, and printing in the Ukrainian language. He also supported architecture, reconstruction of the St. Sophia after 400 and more years of plunder and decline, along with other medieval churches in Kiev. Ivan Mazepa, pictured right, became hetman of the Zaporizhian host in 1687. He was a powerful military leader and also an exemplary patron of the arts, including architecture. So St. Sophia. Mohyla and Mazepa worked with an Italian architect to redevelop the Cathedral of St. Sophia, adding extensively to its exterior form and appearance in the new Ukrainian Baroque manner. Italian architect, Baroque. Western cultural influences had arrived during the Polish occupation. As you see in the lower elevation diagram, portions were heightened and all the domes, including 6 new ones, were covered with distinctive pear-shaped cupola. The Byzantine brickwork was stuccoed and whitewashed, and the central cupola gilded. A bell tower and other structures were added to the monastery. All the new work reflects the Ukrainian Baroque style, which flourished from the end of the 17th to early 18th centuries. Known in Ukraine as the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, the Kievan Cave Monastery was founded in the 11th century and is a primary center of the Eastern Orthodox Christianity in Eastern Europe. The hilltop site gives prominence to the elaborate profiles of the church cupolas and bell tower. The monastery includes numerous monuments, several renovated under Mohyla and Mazepa. Now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Lavra complex is a vast historical and cultural preserve, as this 3D aerial depicts. I'll show the 3 circled structures to you, starting with the Gate of the Trinity, built in the 12th century atop the monastery's main gate. The church had been reconstructed a number of times, but lastly embellished in the new Baroque. Paintings adorn the exterior of the church and the monastery walls, as well as the interior. The church is as famous for its painted decorations as for its architecture. Splendid. The Dormition Cathedral of the 11th to 18th century. Today's cathedral is a reconstruction from 2000, as the building was dynamited in 1941. But the original 11th century building had experienced many changes, finally, with the Cossack Baroque embellishments in the 17th century. The Great Lavra Bell Tower of the mid-18th century, a Kiev landmark, the monastery's bell tower soars above the Dnipro River and distant plains. It was constructed in the mid-18th century, designed in a neoclassical style. Perhaps I'm jumping forward here. It's ascending tiers encircled with Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns, and topped with a Baroque cupola. St. Michael's Golden Domed Monastery, also in Kiev, originated in the Middle Ages, and the church was augmented during the 18th century in this Baroque style. Like the Dormition Cathedral, it was also destroyed, in this case under the Soviets in the 1930s, but rebuilt in 1999. The grand architecture of the Ukrainian Baroque was in construction as the Hetmanate itself was under threat. Already by 1667, Eastern and Western Ukraine were firmly divided. The West under Polish control and the East, including Kiev, the Hetmanate, under Russian. Things went badly for the Cossacks. In 1709, they turned against Russia in battle and lost, the Russians abolishing the Hetmanate entirely in 1767. Baturin, northeast of Kiev, briefly became the Cossack capital. The original 17th century site was destroyed by the Russians in 1709, so what you see is a modern reconstruction. The Russians, looking south to their new lands in the placid agrarian steppe of the former Hetmanate, gave the region a rather patronizing name, Malorossia, or Little Russia. This 1895 painting by Nikolai Sergeyev, a Russian, captures this perspective on the lovely and benign peasant lands. Russian Ukraine. The Russian Empire succeeded the Tsardom in 1721, following a period of extraordinary territorial expansion. The Romanov dynasty would rule Russia for 3 centuries until 1917. Two of the most memorable of its emperors are pictured here, Peter and Catherine the Great. These two maps show Russia's overall expansion and in more detail across future Ukraine. Russia was already in control of the former Hetmanlands we know. Territories further to the west and south were conquered in the 18th century under Catherine the Great, with the demise of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Here, the Age of Enlightenment mainly meant enlightened despots. Russia's imperial takeover had impact on the types and styles of architecture to come in Ukraine. So we return to Kiev, where 18th century culture was still largely Polish, but imperial court visits did occur and required an appropriate setting, the Mariinsky Palace. It was built in the middle of the 18th century under Romanov Empress Elisaveta, who designed by the Italian architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli, who was then working extensively in the Russian Empire. Rastrelli's famous late Baroque style was opulent and imposing inside and out, suited to the palace's ceremonial purpose. St. Andrew's Church is an outstanding late Baroque confection, also designed by Rastrelli, replacing earlier wooden churches on a hillside site apparently visited by St. Andrew himself in the 1st century AD, and who proclaimed a great future city. Well, Kiev. The Myatinsky Arsenal was built at the end of the 18th century by order of Catherine the Great for the manufacture and storage of ammunition and cannonry. The spare yellow brick structure is considered the first neoclassical building in Kiev and was repurposed as a museum in 2007, a very hip and groovy museum, as I understand it. This was Catherine's preferred architectural style. She found the extravagance of the Baroque to be tasteless and imposed neoclassicism as the official imperial style. Her imprint is felt most strongly along the Black Sea territories she conquered, particularly in the port city of Odessa. I'd love to take you there, but can't. Or in countryside estates, like the Kachanivka Palace of the 1770s. One of these popular country estates, this one built by Catherine II's Viceroy of Little Russia. Designed by a Russian, Karl Blank, it is this architect's first work in the new neoclassical style. I think it looks like his first neoclassical work, frankly, but a nice painting. So Russia had become a major European nation, and its capital at St. Petersburg, a magnet for cultural as well as politics. Ukrainian artists and architects were turning north for training and patronage. Several that we think of as Russian were in fact Ukrainian. At the same time, regional institutions were created to support education and culture, albeit Russian, an initiative called Russification. The first modern university in Ukraine was established in 1805 at Kharkiv. Those in Kiev and Odessa soon followed. Although Russian, these schools did promote the study of local history and ethnography, a stimulus to a growing Ukrainian national movement. The Kiev Imperial University of St. Vladimir was founded in 1834 by Tsar Nicholas I. Its memorable red building, completed in 1842, shows a spare neoclassical design with an astonishing red finish. Its Ukrainian name since 1939 is Taras Shevchenko National University, in recognition of the most famous of the leaders of Ukraine's national awakening. So who was he, and what was this national awakening? Beginning in the late 18th century, the concept of national identity emerged across Europe with a claim that culturally distinct nations have a right to self-rule. The existence of national, not imposed languages was one such distinction, such as the Ukrainian vernacular. Writists and artists joined this movement, seeking inspiration in local traditions of folk music and tales, folk buildings, even attire, hence Ukraine's national awakening. Taras Shevchenko was the omni-talented Ukrainian who promoted the independence of his homeland through many actions as a writer, an artist, a folklorist, ethnographer, and political activist. His writings formed the foundation for modern Ukrainian literature and the modern written language. Shevchenko often visited the countryside and created a folio of drawings entitled Picturesque Ukraine. So the two paintings to the right from this period show his affection for the countryside with interesting architectural backdrops, and also the sketches to the left, including one of his parents' extremely modest hut. He had very simple origins. Anyway, okay. 19th century urban developments. Along with intellectual developments, the 19th century physical environment was also changing quickly, with Kiev a key administrative center. The empire supported growth of modern manufacturing, trade, and especially expanding export of grain. The population grew exponentially. New construction was everywhere. The upper and lower districts of Kiev were connected by an important route, the Andreevsky descent, with St. Andrew's Baroque Church at the upper end and commercial Podil below. Merchants and craftspeople built their establishments along this road, several of these now considered historic treasures, such as the handsome house where the writer Mikhail Bulgakov once lived. Kiev's lower city, filled with wooden houses, taverns, and shops, in 1850, one area there was cleared to form a new square. And when the city council building, or Duma, was completed at its edge in 1869, it became Dumska Square, today's Independence Square, the famous Maidan. As the city grew, so did the need for new connections across the wide, increasingly busy Dnipro River, deploying modern engineering and construction. Here are the Tsar Nicholas I suspension bridge and the Struve Railroad Bridge, a box truss design. The vast Russian Empire required a modern transportation network, and during the mid-19th century, rail lines were built to connect its key cities, with a line between Moscow and Odessa by way of Kiev, advancing Kiev's role as a transport hub. Kiev's first railroad station, an eclectic masonry design, was completed in 1870, same year as the Dnipro Railroad Bridge. 19th century eclecticism. As the 19th century unfolded, new types of buildings came into existence to serve urban expansion and an emerging middle class. Some were utilitarian and commercial types, others educational and cultural, and as always, churches. Architectural trends continued to spread from abroad, now eclectic mixtures and revivals, neo-Gothic, neo-Romanesque, neo-Renaissance, neo-Byzantine. St. Volodymyr Cathedral in Kiev is a terrific example of eclectic Byzantine revival, a style appropriate to this seat of the Kiev Patriarchate and its celebration of Prince Volodymyr's baptism 900 years previous. The building's form is traditional in plan and dome arrangements, but very different proportions, you'll note. The details are especially decorative and colorful inside and out. The Jewish population of Kiev was significant. The Brodsky Choral Synagogue in Kiev of 1898 was designed by Ukrainian architect Georgy Schleifer in an eclectic Romanesque revival style. A basilica in plan with tripartite organization of nave and aisles expressed on the facade behind, you'll see that later, projecting addition. More Schleifer. This same architect designed 2 apartment buildings in Kiev a decade apart, revealing changes taking place around the turn of the century. The heavy-handed neo-Baroque, very heavy-handed, of the Ginsburg apartments below left of 1901 gives way to a much lighter touch with the Schleifer apartments of 1910, a mature Art Nouveau design, a style in itself without direct reference to the past, modern architecture. This well-known urban mansion of Semyon Mogilevsev, a timber tycoon, is affectionately called the Chocolate House, an eclectic design by Russian architect Nikolaev. It appears neo-Renaissance on the outside, with interior rooms showing a variety of styles, Moorish, Byzantine, even Art Nouveau. And by the way, so you should explore both Kharkiv and Lviv for more examples of Art Nouveau and secession architecture. I've got lots, but I can't show them today. Kiev in 1900 was a prosperous and typical European city, but on the brink of monumental change. Revolutionary Ukraine. The Ukrainian People's Republic of 1917 to 21 existed briefly as a country, not evidenced in architecture, but marking a critical historic transition. The Republic was brought into existence by Russia's February Revolution and proclaimed its full independence in January of 1918. It was a short-lived proposition, rife with internal political factions and outside forces vying for takeover, as pictured in this illustration. Ukraine's subsequent civil war was part of the larger Russian civil war, and Ukraine ultimately emerged as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, 1922, founding member of the new Soviet Union. There was a brief interval in the 1920s when revolution transformed art and architecture, which is to say, design conveyed a physical and artistic vision of the new world promised by international socialism. Most designs were visionary and never built, and most were created in Moscow, where this internationalist action was. However, Ukrainian artist and theater designer Alexandra Exter, who made her mark also in Moscow and Paris, ran her workshops at her studio in Kiev. For a fragmentary view of this new avant-garde, which I'd love to dwell upon, of course. I include two of her dynamic theater set designs, a sort of representation for architecture. More maps. On the left is a map of the Ukrainian SSR in 1922, with Kharkiv circled, its new capital city, a fresh start for Soviet Ukraine. Above right is a map of Ukraine's future growth in the 20th century. Kharkiv, the new Ukrainian SSR capital. As the capital of Soviet Ukraine from 1922 to 1934, Kharkiv was developed more intensively than most other Soviet cities. In the 19th century, Kharkov was the seat of a Russian imperial governorate, and while mainly Russian speaking, also a lively center of Ukrainian culture. After 1922, as the new capital of Ukraine, a number of governmental projects were approved to be built in the official constructivist style. Constructivist architecture. Constructivism was a revolutionary modern approach to design intended to express and serve communist society, a rejection of past decorative styles in favor of advanced materials and construction methods, consisting mainly of simple geometric forms with functional purposes. Architects working in Kharkiv during the 20s and 30s were actually able to build their ideas for this new architecture, in part because there was real work to be done creating the new capital city, its institutions, housing, and industries. The Jirprom building, or Palace of Industry, built between 25 and 28, was the new administrative center of Kharkiv and is considered the most ambitious realization of constructivist design in all of the Soviet Union. Its first modern skyscraper, and in 1928, the most spacious single building in the world. And of course, you can see it's really three connected structures, designed by three Russian architects. The complex housed myriad state ministries and government offices and included gathering spaces, auditoriums, restaurants, etc., which provided for its more significant social and ideological purpose. The composition of stepped volumes allowed for play of light and shadow over bare concrete surfaces. One critic called it an organized mountain. The concrete construction was indeed a new modern technology. The fan-shaped complex frames a vast public space. The Dzerzhinsky Square, now Freedom Square. Old photographs show the contrast between the huge complex and the scale of human activities, even through long winters. Workers' clubs formed a central part of the communist social agenda for forming the new Soviet man and woman. Though appropriate entertainment and through appropriate entertainment and educational activities. These clubs were built across the Soviet Union. They included libraries, craft workshops, dance halls, auditoriums, places for workers to interact and learn at the end of the workday. The architecture of the Builders Club in Kharkiv is a pure expression of constructivist principles, as interpreted by its three young Ukrainian architects. Functionally, activities are housed in simple volumes around a central courtyard, including a gymnasium and central meeting hall, and a glassy, curved stairway expressed as a tower marking the complex, its vertical form contrasting with the club's dominant horizontal lines. Kharkiv's population grew dramatically across the 1920s, not just an administrative center, the city was also developed as a major industrial center, following Stalin's first 5-year plan for national industrialization. New Kharkiv was created for workers of the Kharkov tractor plant, first phase completed in 1933. So this is the new Soviet housing just on the outside of town. You can kind of sense that here. The new Soviet housing experiments in communal living were implemented in the new Kharkiv city. Communal meaning shared kitchens and bathrooms, daycare, laundries, and other support facilities. laid out according to socialist city planning principles, combining social and industrial life in strictly functional blocks of parallel buildings. That was then. So Joseph Stalin began his takeover of the leadership of the Soviet Union after Lenin's death in 1924 and became a virtual dictator by the 1930s when he instituted a centralized command economy, agriculture collectivization, and rapid industrialization, with ultimately devastating effects for Ukraine. In 1932 and 33, a combination of grain seizures and forced collectivization of peasant farms created famine conditions across Ukraine and resulted in a genocide called the Holodomor. Millions died. In addition, Persians, arrests, executions of writers and other intellectuals were an attempt to erase all aspects of Ukrainian nationalism. In 1934, Stalin moved the Ukrainian SSR's capital from Kharkiv back to Kiev. Stalin, as a dictator, asserted his mark on architecture with an abrupt return to a monumental neoclassical style, a complete rejection of the avant-garde in favor of imperial scale tradition, along with the new socialist realism to be practiced in all the arts. Stalinist historicism was realized in Kiev's new government quarter of 35 and the building of commissariats of 38, both by Russians, overblown, if not to say bombastic, but not without parallels in the architecture of other totalitarian regimes. Can think of Hitler's New Berlin or Mussolini's Rome. On the other hand, commercial buildings like the Zoom department store of 39 were more typical of the era. This design, a handsome Art Deco. Industry was more straightforward as well. During the mid-1930s, the Dnipro River was harnessed for electricity by a huge dam downriver from Kiev and Zaporizhia. Then, of course, came World War II and more extreme hardship. Ukraine was one of the most devastated parts of Europe. 5 to 7 million people perished, 10 million were left homeless. Afterwards, Stalin's pre-war system of Soviet totalitarian control resumed, and surviving Ukrainian nationalists and cosmopolitans, otherwise known as Jews, continued to be persecuted. Stalin's vision of monumental historicist design persisted in the early post-war years in Kiev. The urban combination of Kreshchatyk Boulevard and then called October Revolution, future Independence Square, are opulent examples. Only after Stalin's death in 1953, when Nikita Khrushchev came to power, did Ukrainian fortunes start to shift. Khrushchev's rejection of Stalin's cult of personality and architecture and his eventual policy of administrative and economic decentralization aided Ukraine's eventual recovery and growth to a degree. A cultural thaw followed, and by the 1970s, post-war changes reached the practices of architecture. Building programs, still state-controlled, aspired to communism's support of egalitarian social objectives. I'll show you a few examples. First, this so-called UFO building, or the Kiev Institute of Scientific and Technical Information, designed by a couple of Ukrainian architects, completed in 1971. This dynamic modernist composition with precarious flying saucer hints at the era's space race. Some see a parallel in Oscar Niemeyer's designs for Brasilia. We've been seeing a lot of that lately, of 1960, was a likely source of inspiration. Global trends were not unknown in post-war Ukraine. The disc-shaped auditorium was intended for performances combining music, light, and color, but in the end used for ordinary lectures and movies. The building remains home to the original institute, not in the best repair, and only recently saved from demolition for making way for shopping malls. That's to say, saved before 2022. We don't know further. Two mirrored sculptural crematoria called Halls of Remembrance, designed by a group combining architect with artists, are the centerpiece of Kiev's Memory Park. The layered white concrete crematorium shelves were intended to present a gentle, embracing, and therapeutic setting for mourners, as softly shown in the rendering. Structural ambition characterized post-war architecture both east and west. And in Ukraine, the large spaces of covered market halls were often candidates for large span designs. Does the Zhitny market in Kiev remind you of a famous US airport? Does it? Dulles, Aerosaarinen? Yep. Universities expanded during the post-war decades in Ukraine as everywhere to serve state objectives for academic excellence. The Taras Shevchenko National University in Kiev was increasing its fields of study, had outgrown its original campus, remember that red building, hence this new educational campus on the city's outskirts, completed around 1980 in brutalist concrete. The new complex is anchored by the physics faculty building and includes other computer and math-based faculties. Relief carvings celebrate each discipline, and this interior street apparently links them together. So contemporary Kiev, our lifetimes for sure. In December 1st, 1991, Ukraine's voters approved its parliament's Declaration of Independence. And that same month, the Soviet Union was dissolved. Political instability did follow. Ukraine's new governments either tied with Russia or inclined westward toward NATO and the EU. Deepening pressures from Moscow yielded the famous Maidan protests of 2013, and progressed. Poroshenko won the presidency in 2014. But that year, Russia reclaimed Crimea and began its fighting in the eastern Donbass. Ukraine has persevered, as we well know, and now has elected our hero of the moment, of the hopefully foreseeable future, in Volodymyr Zelensky. Despite this turbulent political backdrop, rampant corruption and economic extremes, Kiev continued to grow vertically and horizontally to reach a population of nearly 3 million before these recent events. Housing varies across Kiev, vast neighborhoods of older slab blocks for ordinary folks, and grand new developments for the new wealthy oligarchy, like the Obolon district bordering the Dnipro River. So I'd like to end this presentation with a sampling of projects from the most recent past, including Comfort Town of 2019. Within a tight budget, the architects of this large and cheerful housing development used varied colors and silhouettes for a layout incorporating both internal streets and courtyards, ample plantings, and I've read well-designed apartments, integrating schools and services to achieve a visually lively and livable environment. This theater is a modernist addition to Kiev's historic Podil district. It offends some, but has won a number of design prizes. The warm-colored brick base forms a good connection in scale with adjacent buildings, while the interior presents a spare contemporary performance space. The design is by the firm of Oleg Drozdov, an architect, artist, and educator, founder of the Kharkiv School of Architecture, a new private institution. His office, begun in Kharkiv in 1997, has recently relocated to Lviv. He's an important figure in the contemporary design community, so we'll keep our eyes on Oleg. Okay. Babyn Yar's memorial site. Babyn Yar means Baba's ravine, and we look back toward World War II. During 2 tragic days in 1941, about 34,000 of Kiev's remaining Jewish population were assembled and shot within this ravine by the occupying German military. Other killings followed, an estimated of 100,000 by 1994, when the Soviets retook the city. This was one of the largest mass killings in one place during World War II. After the Babin Yar site, now a park, after the war, this site, now a park, became symbolic of Ukraine's struggles to commemorate the war and the Holocaust. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 91, a menorah-shaped monument to the Jewish victims was erected 50 years after those killings. Indeed, several war memorials have been built at the Babin Yar site. In 2016, an ambitious but highly contested, privately sponsored Holocaust Memorial Center project was initiated, now of course halted by the war. Of its several components, only a few were realized, including the mirror field of 2020, a field of reflective columns riddled with bullet holes, and with a sound sculpture loop that murmurs the names of the dead. And this, the Babin Yar Synagogue of 2021. This tiny open-air synagogue is the most recent of the memorials and offers a fitting ending to my presentation. Its Swiss architect Manuel Hertz describes his concept like this: from a flat object of a book, when we open it, new worlds unfold. So with the aid of cranks and pulleys and so forth, the Babin Yar Synagogue indeed unfolds, as you'll see in this video.
We'll clean it up.
So thank you, everyone. Let me close with this wonderful wish we all share for peace on earth. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Brooke. We have several questions. So if Brooke is right there, because the questions will pertain, some of the ones are for him first. Okay. Okay, so let's go over here. Okay, so I'm reading them in order in which they came in. Okay, and the first question was from Maisie. And it is, what is needed in the design of a granary? And what needs create the design? Brooke?
That's for you, Brooke. Hi, Maisie.
I don't know. I guess we're looking at ourselves right now. Or at Debbie. Let's see. On that opening slide, I had some information, but basically a granary has to protect the food from the grain from being wet, from getting moldy, to stop insects from attacking it, like weevils or ants, from rodents, animals from getting it, and from being stolen. So basically, it typically requires a technology that's slightly higher than a place where one would live, right? And that becomes very important. The original way they dried material was to create an elevated floor and heat underneath it to dry out all the material. And that would be used as a threshing floor. And then they would take the material and put it into a container, whether it becomes a jar or a large building, to hold it. It's better if there's the most volume with the least perimeter. And so basically an egg is like that. And next to that, a cylinder. So like bees make honeycombs, you create something that is large. It turns out that weevils that attack the grain, insects that attack the grain, can only survive for a certain dimension away from the wall, right?
Wow.
So when you're building a granary, it should actually not have corners where it's exposed to too much perimeter, and goes on and on and on and on and on.
Okay. Well, the next question is also for you. It's a long one. What else do we know about various diets? Did grain make up the majority of what was eaten? Did root cellars to preserve vegetables enter into the storage ideas at any point during the time you have covered? And this is from, I think, Eliza.
Oh, Eliza. Oh, Eliza.
So Brooke.
I hear you. I'm trying to recall the entire question.
Okay, it started out, what else do we know about the various diets? Do you hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
I got you.
okay, didn't know.
Well, one of the things, if it's recorded, you might be able to check on this, but the entry of all sorts of different grains and what they call cereals occurred early in antiquity, like 5,000 years ago. But and each has its uniqueness, and also the fact that even in these ancient times, they knew about rotating crops. They knew about giving nitrogen to the soil to make sure that they would get the best yields. And so they experimented with these. So there was a lot of experimentation with hybridizing corns. When they talk about domestic cereals, they're actually talking about modifications made to the different cereals. And it goes on to talk about millet and sorghum and corn and all sorts of different things that they they use. In root cellars, of course, is depending on where you are, become very important and have their own way of being taken care of. I'm only doing granaries.
Okay, got it. Okay, let me see. Okay, this is from George, and this is about granaries. Okay, granaries I have seen in the Alps. I don't know how to pronounce this, Ticino, etc.
It's in
Yeah.
northern Italy, right?
I guess.
Yes.
Ask George. Okay, generally protect the grain from pillage by rodents by setting the crib on flat stones placed horizontally on stone posts, preventing rats and mice.
From reaching the
Wait,
granary itself.
I'm having a hard time getting this up here because it keeps skipping past it.
But we can picture these. We can picture these.
We've seen these as well. And it's also in Austria, there are some beautiful wooden buildings, granaries that are built on top of stone piers. And then there's a circular disc. And then the wooden structure is built on top of that to indeed keep animals from being able to walk right up and climb in onto the granary itself. But it also means you have to make sure there's not a lot of trees around so they can't climb the trees and drop down.
Okay. And then he says many of the granaries presented showed little that seemed able to block the access to rodents. Are they equipped with other preventions?
There's a common use of cats.
Okay, that was the next part he asked. Okay,
So that's one, yeah.
okay.
Debbie,
Yes,
I'd like to add that in fact, people believe that the self-domestication of cats accompanied the rise of grain production and the agricultural revolution. So that was an important role, but I was thinking all the same things when Brooke was showing his granaries, and I've seen them in other places like England with the little flat things on top. But as a homeowner now with a bird feeder and squirrels, I can't help but think that they were all failed efforts to keep out rodents. When it comes right down to it, I think that they were all smarter than any of the granary designs. The one thing I think worked was that by having them be elevated with air underneath is that they kept it somewhat dry for the grain to keep it from being moldy.
right.
I don't think humans ever came up with an effective way of keeping rodents out other than the cats.
Let me add one thing. If you take a look at Egyptian art, you will find that the cat is deified. Like the dung beetle is deified. The
Okay.
cat is deified.
Enough of this cat loving stuff.
Okay, all right. Okay, this one's also from George. Any thoughts about the origins of the cellular domes to create large enclosed spaces, such as derived primarily from architectonic expedients, frequent piers to support small domes, and or logistical, religious, or political? I'm sorry, my screen is so small here. Or
What is
political
this
metaphors.
question for? Is this question about grain?
This is about, let me go back to the beginning. Any thoughts about the origins of cellular domes to create large enclosed spaces? So I would think that would be for you, Judy.
Well, yeah, although the domes, the domes that you saw in the Baroque buildings, for example, are largely, are very much decorative in their extreme shapes. Some of the earlier domes, of course, were simple masonry strategies for covering space, for enclosing a roof.
Okay. George, do you want to ask anything related to that?
He may be gone.
Okay. All right. So this one's from Mark. Okay. The propaganda supporting the Russian invasion of Ukraine claims that there really isn't a separate Ukrainian ethnicity or national identity. Could you explain this a bit more and tell us if architecture, wait, I just got to bring this down. I am so sorry. This is so small and it
Well,
just.
Mark's right here. He can ask the question.
Okay. Mark, you want to
Yes,
ask it first
could
and
you-
unmute?
Could you explain this a bit more and tell us if architecture reveals distinctions between Ukrainian and Russian culture?
Does architecture alone do this? Well, I mean, yes and no. Certainly, in the earlier days when they were more distant, you could distinguish Kievan Rus Baroque, the Hetmanate Baroque, as being this architecture was indeed the mothership that tended to spread north. Russia being well behind in its development in those early centuries. As we reach the era of the empire, we reach eras of more international cultures, quite frankly, and especially with the strong imprint of Poland overlapping in Ukraine. So I'm not sure you can say architecture alone distinguishes. Certainly, if we were looking at maybe more vernacular architecture, we could pinpoint some more precise things. But you know, empire is by its nature sort of opposed to differences, and so it's and I guess I'm going to ask, because I see her here, Alexandra, my friend from Drexel, who might have her own thoughts on this because she's an authentic Ukrainian, whereas I'm only, you know, sort of like a supporter. Do you have any thoughts, Alexandra?
Unfortunately, not specifically related to architecture. I think culturally, there's a lot of differences. There's a lot of linguistic differences, but unfortunately, Mark can't point to architecture for that purpose. But, you know, I would say very strongly that there's a lot of differences and they shouldn't be confused. And Ukraine is older than Russia.
There are a lot of cultural differences writ broadly. My other friend from junior high school on Helena is also here, and I'm sure she has also, not an architect. She's surpasses all of that. She's a librarian, but so she knows how to find all the answers. Do you have any thoughts, Helena?
Well, first of all, I did message you. You did a very well-balanced presentation. As a Ukrainian patriot, raised by Ukrainian patriots, I was very pleased that your information was consistent with what I knew. So I thank you for that. I thank you for that because it has been skewed. And I just wrote to you that because the history of Ukraine has been misrepresented so much, my parents, who did not have much money, gave a huge amount of money for the endowment of a chair at Harvard on Ukrainian studies in order to correct the misinformation. As far as the distinction between Russian and Ukrainian, as somebody raised in the Ukrainian culture and language, I see it, and I studied Russian, I speak it fluently. There is a real contrast between the two cultures in a variety of ways that it's impossible to encapsulate in this kind of a discussion. But I wish there was an answer architecturally for the differences. I love Kiev. I've been to Kiev, and the architecture there, I think, is, Judy, to some extent unique to that city. I mean, in the sense that you don't really see a replication of it in the Moscow area, right?
You know, yes and no, Helena. I mean, I have not been to Kiev. I have been to Moscow. There are splendid churches and
with cupolas, right? With cupolas.
Yeah, but you know, which I think, you know, is this inherited culture as it flowed north.
Right.
Mark, this goes back to your original question. This is pretty sticky, but Ukraine today does really is proud of itself as a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. So, and we did not spend time in Lviv or much in Kharkov, and in any place you go, there are regional identities. So let's all just organize a field trip once it's safe.
Well, it strikes me, well, that old phrase that the first victim of war is truth, but the pernicious Russian propaganda about there being no Ukraine, is really kind of frightening in some ways, but it's essentially stealing the identity of your opponent, right? In a way that it's frightening, is absolutely frightening. And I was thinking, like, if let's say, if the United States decided to invade Canada, we could say, well, we're really the same people. They really pretend they're different, but they're not. People could make those arguments. In this case, the Canadians have the same language, except for Quebec. And we share so many cultural similarities. But the idea that the Russians feel like they can impose this upon people who've independently said, no, we're not with you, is horrifying. And we're all horrified by what's going on there. And but again, I'm just kind of amazed at how they're using the idea of ethnicity or the lack of a separate identity as a propaganda tool. And that's been picked up by the right-wing media in this country.
We know this from the Nazis in World War II, who were intent on taking Ukraine as their Lebensraum, right?
Yeah.
That was, Ukraine was going to disappear under the Germans, language as well as every last person.
Yeah.
So there have been, Ukraine has been, has had a really rough go of it in history.
The national anthem of Ukraine is
Yes.
Ukraine still exists. They simply will not give up their identity.
This is true. This is a first line which they share, interestingly, with the Poles, who have the similar first line to their national anthem.
Ukraine has not died. Yeah.
No, not yet. We're
No.
here.
And
Okay. Are there any more key
Yes,
questions?
there are. And the next comment is from Helena, and maybe she wants to.
my comment regarding the spelling of Kozak. Is that what?
Yes.
I see absolutely a lot of us in the Ukrainian community have wondered how in the world did it morph from Kozak, K-O-Z-A-K, in terms of phonetically, to C-O-S-S-A-C-K. We don't know how it happened, but I consistently stay with Kozak, K-O-Z-A-K. And on a slight tangent, my father's birth certificate said son of a Cossack, and his father's birth certificate, son of a Cossack. So I am the daughter of a Cossack.
There you go.
So I take my Cossack spelling seriously.
I think there's a lot of, I'm going to say sort of almost a cartoon culture around the Cossacks as their their lore spread across nations. I knew about Cossacks before I knew about Ukrainians. So much has it been popularized in a cartoonish way, shall we say?
Yeah, I know. But
So there you go.
They did have their children. And my grandfather was the son of a Cossack, and my father was the son of a Cossack. So there's a culture, there's a Cossack culture, and you'd have to be a Ukrainian to know the fine points of it.
Okay, so let's go to a non-Cossack question.
Okay, the next one is another one from Mark. And this is a broad and difficult question, but how did Ukraine become such an internationally important breadbasket? I have read that the impoundment of Ukrainian grain could lead to famines in South Asia and Africa.
Okay, so first of all, it has something called black earth. It has a natural resource in its soils that are almost unprecedented. So it's very rich in its farmland. And that has been known since those first agriculturalists ever settled there in the beginning, or the first grain cultures of Ukraine. So it has provided grains to North Russia, to to Europe. I mean, over history, it exported grain consistently. Now with the Black Sea ports, because of course Ukraine didn't have the Black Sea, it was others who did the shipping. But once Catherine the Great claimed the North Sea coast and made ports at places like Odessa, could shipping take place increasingly at the modern scale. And so Ukraine is indeed feeding the famine-riddled places in Africa and further beyond, because of course we have the Suez Canal, we have the, not only the Bosporus leading into the Mediterranean, but the canals and Gibraltar and there they go out into the world. So yeah, it's been a bread basket. Sorry, my brain is dust now. Forever. Is that enough?
Yes, perfect. Okay, the next one is from Ellen Goldsmith to Judy and Brooke. Thank you. You've unfolded so much. Jane Nice has said, this is amazing, from the amount I've learned from Brooke's part to the chills I've felt seeing from Judy's portfolio of Ukraine's historical arch buildings up to the memorial and synagogue. Thank you so much.
I hope
Okay.
you all loved that synagogue as much as I do. I just think it's magical.
And then finally from George, I was just curious about the form following function or attitude. And that's all I have on that.
Is this about constructivists?
Is George here?
I don't think, he's not one of the names I see. Anyhow,
Because that's where it ends. Does anybody else have any questions? Well, thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Brooke and Judy, for doing a
hi,
wonderful
Rafi, where are you?
presentation.
Rafi, hi. Yeah, we have friends here from hither and thither. So thanks, everybody, so much.
Judy and Brooke, thank you so much. We
Thank
enjoyed
you.
every
Thanks,
minute. of
Eliza.
it. It was So wonderful.
but it was.
Okay,
Good
well,
to see
thank
you
you
guys.
so much. And at this point, I'm going to end. So have a great evening.
Mark, toodles. Alexandra, thank you.
I think that's me.